She didn't want to do the interview. That's the first thing you need to know. For a long time, Annie Guthrie stayed quiet. She watched from the sidelines while the world formed opinions about her sister. While headlines got written by people who didn't know either of them, not really. While a version of Savannah got built in the public imagination, brick by brick, until it felt permanent and solid and real. But it wasn't the whole truth. And at some point, staying quiet started to feel like lying. So she spoke. And the moment she did, one detail slipped out. Not dramatically, not with any warning. It came out the way things do when someone has been holding them too long, quietly, almost casually, like it was nothing. But it wasn't nothing. It landed like a stone dropped into still water. And the ripples didn't stop, because it reframed everything. The career, the image, the story millions of people thought they already understood. There's a version of Savannah Guthrie the world knows. The polished anchor, the steady voice behind the desk every morning. The woman who has interviewed presidents, covered breaking news without flinching, and shown up reliably for years in the way that makes you forget she's even a person, and not just a fixture of American mornings. And then there's the version her sister knows. Those two versions are not the same. People who grow up in the same house develop something that's hard to explain to outsiders: a shared language. A shorthand built from years of living side by side through the same storms, the same family moments, the same nights that never made it into anyone's story but their own. The Guthrie sisters had that. They were close in the way that only happens when two people have navigated real life together, not the performed version of it. Savannah was always the one drawn toward communication, toward being in the room where things happened, toward asking the question everyone else was too polished or too afraid to ask. Annie watched that happen from close range. She saw the ambition, yes, but she also saw everything behind it, the anxiety that never made it to camera. The doubt that lived in private kitchens and late-night phone calls. The version of her sister that had absolutely nothing to do with television. For years, that version stayed protected. Savannah's public presence was so consistent, so composed, that the private person underneath became almost invisible to the outside world. That's how it works when you're very good at something. You become the role becomes you, and somewhere in the middle, the real person gets quietly buried underneath the performance. But sisters remember. They remember the girl before the career. Before the cameras and the carefully worded statements and the professional image that has to be maintained at all costs. Annie remembered. And that memory was exactly what made her silence so difficult to hold on to, and what made her words, when they finally came, so impossible to dismiss. She wasn't speaking to damage anything. Her voice throughout the conversation had a protectiveness in it. The kind you hear from someone who loves the person they're talking about and is choosing honesty not to hurt them, but because something has gone quietly. Slowly wrong, in a way that most people hadn't noticed yet. And she needed someone to know. The thing about Savannah's public life is that it looks seamless. Decades of broadcasting. A presence that felt permanent, stable, reliable. But what most viewers never saw, what cameras never quite captured, was the cost. Not the obvious cost. Not the long hours and early call times that TV personalities sometimes mention almost cheerfully, like a badge of honor. The other cost, the quieter one, Annie described it carefully. Choosing her words the way someone does when they've thought about this for a very long time. When they've rehearsed how to say something true without it sounding like an attack on the person they love most. She talked about a shift she'd noticed. Gradual at first. So slow you could almost miss it. The phone calls got shorter. The conversations moved to the surface. There was still warmth. The warmth never disappeared, but something underneath it had changed. A kind of distance had opened up. Not geographic, emotional. The kind that happens when someone is carrying enormous, sustained pressure and has quietly forgotten how to ask for help or stopped believing they're allowed to. She was carrying more than people realized. 6 words, that's all Annie said at first. She wasn't giving details yet, just cracking the door. Just enough light to see that the room behind it was darker than anyone expected. and the people listening felt something shift. Because here's the thing about people we admire from a distance. We build a version of them in our heads. We assemble that version from public appearances and headlines and moments caught on camera, and we convince ourselves that version is complete. That we know them, that the person we see is the person that exists, then someone who actually knows them speaks, and the version we built starts to come apart. Annie wasn't tearing anything down. But she was being honest, and honesty, sometimes, is its own kind of disruption. She mentioned a specific period, a stretch of time that looked completely fine from the outside. Savannah was on television every morning. Present, sharp, smiling, the kind of performance that makes you think nothing could possibly be wrong, but Annie knew what was happening off camera. She knew about an exhaustion that went deeper than tired, the kind that sleep doesn't fix, the kind that settles into your bones and quietly changes the way you see yourself and everything around you. She knew about a particular moment she had witnessed directly, a moment where the performance had dropped completely and what was underneath came through without warning. She didn't describe it fully, just enough to make clear it had happened, that it was real, and that it had changed how she saw everything that came after. There's a specific kind of grief that comes from watching someone you love disappear inside their own success. It sounds like a strange thing to grieve. Success is supposed to be good, the reward, the goal everyone is working toward, but Annie described it so precisely that it stopped sounding strange immediately. The more she achieved, the less of her there was. That line carries weight. Because it wasn't jealousy. It wasn't bitterness dressed up as concern. It was genuine loss. The kind you feel when someone is standing right in front of you and somehow they're still gone. What she was describing was a trade. Savannah had traded pieces of herself, slowly, maybe without fully realizing it, for the career, for the position, for the identity the world had handed her that she had, over time, started to need in ways that weren't healthy. That's not a crime. That's a very human, very quiet thing that happens to ambitious people who love what they do. But it has consequences, for the person living it. And for the people who love them and have to watch from the outside. Annie had tried to have a conversation, more than once. The kind of conversation that requires real courage to start and real patience to survive, where you try to reach past someone's defenses and remind them of who they were before all of this. Savannah didn't receive it well, not angrily. That's not quite the right word, more like someone who hears the words but can't let them in. Who nods, says the right things, and then quietly goes back to the same patterns because the alternative, stopping, really stopping, and looking honestly at what's underneath, feels too frightening to face. Annie understood. She didn't blame her sister, but understanding didn't make it easier to watch. And then came the detail, the one that changed everything. She mentioned it almost offhandedly. The way you mention something when you've been sitting with it so long, it no longer feels explosive to you, even though it absolutely is to everyone hearing it for the first time. It was about something Savannah had said during a particularly brutal stretch, a private moment, one where the performance dropped completely and what was underneath came through without any filter. Annie described the shape of it, the feeling of those words, and the feeling was this: Savannah wasn't sure she could keep going, not the career, not the schedule. She wasn't sure she could keep going as the person she had become. That's different from burnout. That's different from stress or exhaustion or needing a vacation. That's someone standing at an edge they never expected to find themselves near. Someone who has spent so long performing strength that they've lost the map back to something real. And the only person who knew was a sister watching from a distance, holding this quietly, trying to figure out what to do with a truth that heavy. When a secret lives inside a family long enough, it becomes its own kind of presence. It sits at every table. It shapes every conversation without ever being named. The Guthrie family had carried something, and Annie, by speaking, was finally letting it out into the air. She talked about reaching out differently, not the usual check-ins. Not the surface-level conversations that were warm but safe, really reaching out. Going past the places where Savannah would normally redirect with humor, which was, apparently, a well-worn habit. Deflection wrapped up in charm, the smile that changed the subject before the subject could land anywhere dangerous. She was always so good at changing the subject, Annie said. She smiled when she said it, but the smile was sad. This time, Annie didn't let her change it. She held the conversation in the uncomfortable place. Refused to follow when Savannah tried to steer away from it, and something unexpected happened. Savannah let her. For the first time in a long time, she didn't perform. She didn't smile through it. She sat in the discomfort and was honest, genuinely, painfully honest, about what was actually happening inside her. Annie didn't share every word of that conversation. Some of it, she said, wasn't hers to give, but she shared enough. She described her sister as someone who had spent so long being strong for everyone else that she had lost track of how to be vulnerable for herself, who had confused endurance with health, who had started to believe that if she could keep functioning, keep showing up, keep performing, keep appearing fine, then nothing was actually wrong. That as long as the outside held together, the inside could be managed. That belief, Annie said quietly, was the most dangerous part, because it meant Savannah wasn't getting real help. Not the kind that actually interrupts the pattern rather than just managing it for another few weeks. And the people around her had no idea, because she was too composed, too capable, too skilled at building a wall entirely out of competence. The shift came when Annie stopped trying to protect her sister from the weight of the honest conversation and just told her what she saw. Not what she feared, not what she hoped, what she actually saw. And Savannah, after a silence Annie described as the longest of her life, finally said the words she hadn't said to anyone. I know, 2 words, but they carried everything. All the weight of the years of pretending. All the exhaustion of being fine in public while quietly falling apart in private. All the grief of becoming someone you no longer fully recognize when you're alone with yourself. It was all there in those 2 words, and both of them knew it. Annie said she cried. She didn't try to make that sound strong or composed. She just said she cried, and Savannah cried, and for a while they just sat in it together without trying to fix anything or move past it. Which is sometimes the only thing you can do. But it wasn't the end of the story. Here's what people don't understand about choosing to get better. It's not one decision. It's not a single moment of clarity that resolves everything and turns the whole story into something clean. It's 1,000 small decisions made every day, most of them invisible, most of them exhausting, most of them made when no one is watching and there's no reward for it. Savannah made those decisions. That's what Annie wanted people to understand. Not just the struggle, though the struggle was real. Not just the dark period, though it was darker than anyone outside the family knew. She wanted to talk about what came after. The part where her sister, quietly, away from every camera and viewer and headline, started doing the actual work. Not for the career, not for the image. Not to protect anything public. For herself. Annie described watching it happen with a kind of reverence. The way you describe witnessing something you weren't entirely sure you'd ever get to see. The return of someone you thought you might have lost to the version of themselves the world had built around them. It didn't happen overnight. Nothing real ever does. But there were signs. The phone calls got longer. The conversations went deeper. The deflection was still there sometimes. Old habits don't just evaporate, but it was less automatic, more self-aware. Like someone who could now hear themselves doing it and sometimes chose to stop. Savannah started talking about things she'd never talked about before. Her own fears, her actual limits. The specific ways the career had cost her more than she'd ever admitted to anyone, including herself. And then came the detail that stopped everything. Not shocking in a scandalous way. Shocking in the way that real truth sometimes is. When it's so simple and so human that it cuts straight through every complicated thing you thought you understood. Annie said that during one of those conversations, one of the new ones, the honest ones, Savannah had said something she wasn't expecting. She said she was grateful. Grateful for the struggle. Grateful for reaching the point where pretending had stopped being possible. Grateful for the moment of breaking open, because it had led, finally, After all that time, to something that felt real. Not performed gratitude, not the kind that shows up in acceptance speeches and polished interviews. Grateful in the way you can only be when something nearly takes you apart, and instead, slowly, quietly, puts you back together differently. She told Annie that she was, for the first time in years, actually okay. Not performing okay. Not functioning okay while something underneath slowly erodes. Actually okay. Annie paused after sharing that. Just let it sit in the air for a moment. And then she said the thing that landed harder than anything else in the entire conversation. I got my sister back. That was it. That was the whole story. Not a scandal. Not a public unraveling. Not a dramatic collapse that the whole world got to watch and form opinions about. Just a person, a very human, very complicated person, who got lost inside her own life, and then, with the help of someone who loved her enough to keep showing up and tell the hard truth, found her way back to herself. The public version of Savannah is still there. The desk, the morning show, the career, the presence that millions of people tune into without knowing any of this. None of that disappeared. But behind it, quietly, privately, in all the spaces the cameras will never reach, there's someone different now. Someone who knows what she nearly lost. Someone who chose, when it actually mattered, to stop pretending that being fine and being okay were the same thing. And a sister who waited. Who kept showing up even when it was hard, and even when it didn't seem to be working. Who held on to the truth for a long time and finally, when the moment was right, let it out. That story is going to stay with you. Not because of the name attached to it, not because of the career or the fame or anything that has to do with television. Because it belongs to every person who has ever looked completely fine from the outside, while something quieter and harder was happening on the inside. Every family that has carried something heavy and private and didn't know how to put it down. Every moment where someone chose honesty over comfort and it changed the whole direction of things. If any part of this hits somewhere you recognize, you don't have to say much. Just leave something in the comments, even just that you felt it. And if someone in your life needs to hear a story like this right now, don't wait. Send it to them. Sometimes the right story at the right moment is the thing that opens the door.